When the tribunal reconvened, Yoon Seojin did not wait for permission to speak. "Before this tribunal renders its verdict," she said, stepping forward to the central podium with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "I wish to make a proposal." The Chief Justice studied her for a long moment before nodding. "The defense may proceed." Seojin turned to address not just the judges, but the entire chamber. The hundreds of observers who had gathered to witness the fate of humanity, the representatives of species who had forgotten what it meant to feel, and the young ones who were just beginning to remember. "High Chancellor Vorath has asked what we should do about humanity," she said. "And I believe the question itself is wrong, because it assumes that humanity is a problem to be solved, rather than a resource to be shared." She gestured, and a holographic display appeared showing the reports from the warming movement. The thousands of aliens across the galaxy who had sought out humans to learn how to live with their reawakened emotions since my broadcast. Species that had suppressed their emotional capacity for millennia have begun to feel again, Seojin said. And many of them have struggled because they have no framework for processing what they experience. No traditions for carrying grief, no rituals for expressing joy, no language for the territory of the heart. She highlighted a cluster of reports from the Kreth worlds where suicide rates had tripled in the weeks since the FVs broadcast as individuals overwhelmed by unfamiliar feelings chose death over confusion. "Some have not survived the transition," she acknowledged. "And for that I am sorry. More sorry than I can express. But the answer is not to exile humanity and pretend the change never happened. The answer is to help those who are struggling, to teach them what we know, to share the gift instead of hoarding it." "And what would this sharing look like?" the Chief Justice asked. Seojin took a deep breath. "I propose that humanity be granted full membership in the Concord," she said. "Not despite our emotional capacity, but because of it. And in exchange, we will establish training centers on every world that requests them. Places where humans will teach other species how to feel without being destroyed by feeling." The chamber erupted in voices. Some angry, some skeptical, some hopeful. "You would make humanity into emotional missionaries," Boris sneered. "Spreading your contagion deliberately rather than accidentally." "I would make humanity into teachers," Seojin replied. "The same way the Kreth are teachers of engineering, and the Makari are teachers of logic, and the Velothi are teachers of diplomacy. Every species in this Concord contributes something unique, and this would be our contribution." She looked up at the judges, at the ancient beings who held the fate of her species in their hands. "You fear human emotion because you have forgotten what it is for," she said. "You think it makes us weak, but it is the source of everything that makes us strong. It is why humans throw themselves into danger to save strangers. Why we build monuments to people we never met. Why we tell stories about heroes who died 1,000 years before we were born." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Emotion is not a flaw to be corrected," she continued. "It is the force that connects us to each other and to something larger than ourselves. It is what makes sacrifice meaningful and victory sweet and loss bearable. And the galaxy has been operating without it for so long that you have forgotten how to be fully alive." She spread her arms wide. "Let us remind you," she said. "Not through broadcasts that overwhelm your senses, but through patient teaching. Through shared experience, through the slow work of building trust across the boundaries that divide us. Let us show you how to carry the weight of caring without being crushed by it." The Chief Justice leaned forward. "And if we refuse?" she asked. "If we choose exile instead of partnership, what then?" Seojin met her ancient eyes without flinching. "Then you will have proven that the architects were wrong to believe in you," she said. "They gave you the same gift they gave us, and you threw it away. And if you exile us for keeping what you discarded, then you will spend the rest of your history knowing that you had a chance to become whole again and you chose to remain broken. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours then. Slowly, the Chief Justice turned to consult with her fellow judges, their conversation hidden behind a privacy field that shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement. When the field dropped, the Chief Justice's coloring had shifted to something Seojin had never seen before. A deep, warm gold that seemed to glow from within. "The tribunal has reached a verdict," she announced, "on the matter of human origins. We find that the architects modified humanity in the same manner they modified many species represented in this chamber. And we decline to treat this as grounds for punishment, given our own shared history." Seojin felt her knees go weak with relief. On the matter of membership, the Chief Justice continued, "We find that humanity's proposal has merit and deserves serious consideration. We therefore recommend that the full assembly vote on granting Earth membership status with the understanding that humanity will establish emotional education centers as Ambassador Yoon has described." The vote happened 3 days later. It was not unanimous, but it did not need to be by a margin of 7-1. The Galactic Concord Assembly voted to admit Earth as a full member species, the first new member in 300 years. The rationalist bloc stormed out in protest, but their coalition fractured before they reached the exits as younger members broke ranks to embrace their human colleagues. Seojin watched it all from the observation gallery where she had stood so many times before, watching debates in which she had no voice, and she allowed herself to cry, not from grief, but from something she had almost forgotten how to feel: joy. 1 month later, she stood in a classroom on the Concord station, facing a group of 30 students from a dozen species who had come to learn how to live with their reawakened hearts. "Today we will discuss a concept that has no direct translation in most of your languages," she said. "In human English we call it compassion fatigue, and it refers to the exhaustion that comes from caring too much for too long." A young Kreth raised his claw. "Why would anyone care so much that it exhausts them?" he asked. "Surely the rational approach is to moderate one's emotional investment to sustainable levels." Seojin smiled. "That is one approach," she acknowledged. "But humans have found that moderating our caring often means caring less about the things that matter most. And so instead we learn to rest without stopping, to replenish without retreating, to ask for help when the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone." She looked around the room at faces that would have been unreadable to her a year ago but now seemed as clear as open books. Fear and hope and curiosity all mixed together. "Compassion fatigue is not a failure," she said. "It is a wound, the wound you get from caring too much. And humans consider it a badge of honor because it means you have loved something beyond yourself." A young Velothi, whose coloring marked her as barely past adolescence, raised a tendril. "Ambassador," she said, "my elders tell me that before the suppression, our ancestors had a word for this feeling, but it was erased along with the capacity to experience it. Do you think we can ever truly reclaim what was taken from us?" Seojin thought about her brother Jinsu, about the grief she had carried for so long that it had become part of her bones, about the moment when she opened her mind to 400 species and let them feel what she felt. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but I know that you are here, asking that question. And that means something has already been reclaimed. And the rest is just a matter of time and practice and the willingness to keep trying, even when it hurts." The young Velathi's coloring shifted to something Seojin recognized as the beginning of hope. "One more question." The student said, "Do humans ever stop feeling? Do you ever get to rest?" Seojin laughed, a sound that startled several of her students who had never heard a human laugh before. "No," she said. "We never stop. That is our curse and our gift. And now it is yours too." She looked out the window at the stars beyond the station, at the vast galaxy that had finally heard humanity's voice. "And I promise you," she said, "it is worth it." The tribunal chamber had been designed to intimidate, and it succeeded. Yoon Seo-jin stood alone at a podium in the center of a vast circular room, where 12 judges from 12 species looked down at her from elevated platforms arranged like the points of a clock. And behind each judge sat hundreds of observers who had come to watch humanity be put on trial. High Chancellor Vorth of the Kreth Assembly served as chief prosecutor, his rigid exoskeleton gleaming under the harsh lights as he presented the case against Earth. 70,000 years ago, Vorth began. The species known as the Architects visited hundreds of worlds across the galaxy, and on each world they left behind modifications to the dominant life forms. Modifications designed to serve purposes we are only now beginning to understand. He gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber, showing the double helix of human DNA. On Earth, they found a primitive primate species, and they altered it. Vorth continued. They expanded the neural capacity for emotional processing by a factor of 300%. They created new chemical pathways that produce intense bonding responses. They engineered a creature capable of feeling emotions so powerful that exposure to them can overwhelm the neural systems of other species. He paused to let that sink in. They created a weapon, he said. And 3 weeks ago, that weapon was deployed against this assembly. And now the question before this tribunal is simple. What do we do about it? Seo-jin listened to the accusation and felt the weight of 400 species watching her, judging her, waiting to see how humanity would respond to being called an instrument of destruction. The defense may speak, announced the Chief Justice, an ancient Velothi whose coloring had faded to a pale gray that indicated extreme age. Seo-jin stepped forward. High Chancellor Vorth is correct that the Architects visited Earth, she said. Our own archaeological records confirm their presence during a period when the human population had dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals, and we have genetic evidence that suggests they intervened in our development. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. But the High Chancellor has made an assumption that I do not accept, Seo-jin continued. He assumes that because the Architects modified human emotional capacity, they must have done so to create a weapon. And I would like to propose an alternative interpretation. She gestured, and her own holographic display appeared, showing a map of the galaxy with hundreds of points of light marking worlds the Architects had visited. The Architects did not visit just Earth, she said. They visited hundreds of worlds, including the home worlds of many species represented in this chamber. And on each world, they left behind modifications to the dominant life forms. She highlighted several points on the map. The Kreth homeworld was visited, she said. So was the Makari homeworld, so was the Velothi homeworld. So were the homeworlds of 7 of the 12 judges sitting in this chamber today. The murmurs grew louder. If the Architects created humanity to be a weapon, Seo-jin asked, then what did they create the rest of you to be? Vorth rose to object, but the Chief Justice silenced him with a gesture. The defense raises a valid question, the ancient Velothi said. What evidence do we have of Architect modifications to other species? Very little, Vorth admitted, because most species destroyed those records long ago, choosing to forget the circumstances of their own uplift rather than live with the knowledge that they were engineered. But the modifications themselves remain. Seo-jin pressed, hidden in the genetic code of every species the Architects touched. And I believe that if we examined that code carefully, we would find something interesting. She turned to address not just the judges, but the entire chamber. I believe we would find that the Architects gave every species they touched the same gift they gave humanity, she said. The capacity for deep emotional connection, for empathy, for feeling the pain and joy of others as if it were our own. And I believe that most species chose to suppress that gift because they found it too difficult to bear. Speculation. Vorth snapped. Is it? Seo-jin replied. Then perhaps the tribunal should hear from someone who has examined the evidence directly. She looked up at the observers' gallery where Mirith sat watching the proceedings. I call Counselor Mirith of the Velothi to testify. The chamber erupted in chaos as Mirith made their way down to the witness platform, their coloring shifting through patterns of fear and determination that every Velothi in the room could read. Counselor Mirith, Seojin said when order had been restored. You have studied the architect records in your species archives. Records that were sealed centuries ago. Please tell the tribunal what you found. Mirith's voice trembled, but did not break. I found evidence that the architects modified Velothi emotional capacity in the same way they modified human capacity. Mirith said, our ancestors could feel everything that humans feel. The grief and the love and the overwhelming connection to others. But 3,000 years ago, our leaders decided that such feelings made us weak, and they developed genetic therapies to suppress the relevant neural pathways. And they destroyed the records so that future generations would never know what we had lost. The silence that followed was absolute. They did not just suppress the feelings. Mirith continued. They suppressed the memory of the feelings. They made us believe that we had always been this way, cold and rational and alone. And they called it evolution when it was really amputation. Seojin turned back to face the judges. Humanity did not gain something alien when the architects touched us, she said. We simply kept something that others threw away. And now that the galaxy has been reminded of what it lost, some species would rather exile us than face the truth about themselves. She looked directly at High Chancellor Vorith. The Kreth were engineered too, she said. So were the Makari, so were a dozen founding species of this Concord. And all of them made the same choice, to cut away the parts of themselves that felt too much, to become less than they were born to be. And now they stand in judgment of humanity for the crime of remaining whole. Vorith's exoskeleton clicked with barely suppressed rage. This is deflection, he snarled. Whatever other species chose to do with their heritage has no bearing on whether humanity poses a threat to galactic stability. It has every bearing, Seojin replied. Because the question is not whether humanity is dangerous, but whether emotion itself is dangerous. And if the answer is yes, then every species in this chamber should be on trial. Not just us. The Chief Justice called for a recess, and as the chamber emptied, Mirith approached Seojin with fear written across every color of their skin. You did not expose them completely, Mirith whispered. You could have named every species, could have revealed exactly what they had done to themselves. Why did you hold back? Seojin looked out at the delegates filing through the exits. Species who had built a civilization together despite their differences? Species who might tear that civilization apart if the full truth came to light. Because I'm not trying to destroy the galaxy, she said. I am trying to save it, and that means finding a way forward that does not require burning everything down. Then what will you do? Mirith asked Seojin watched the last of. The judges disappeared through the chamber doors, and felt the weight of 12 million saved lives on Varith IV balanced against the billions who might suffer if she chose wrong. I will offer them something better than the truth, she said. What is better than the truth? Seojin smiled, though her eyes remained sad. Hope. 3 weeks after the broadcast, Yoon Sigun stood at the viewport of the Concord Medical Station and watched the relief convoy depart for Varith IV. 17 ships from 12 different species moved in formation toward the jump point, their hulls carrying enough medical supplies to treat a planet. And as they vanished into the fold of space that would carry them across the galaxy, Seojin allowed herself a small moment of something that felt almost like hope. You have changed everything, said a voice behind her, and she turned to find Counselor Mirith standing in the doorway, the young Velathi's coloring shifting through patterns that Seojin now recognized as wonder mixed with fear. The broadcast has been copied and shared across every major communication network. And species that have not felt strong emotions in 10,000 years are suddenly experiencing things they have no language for. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Seojin asked. Both, Mirith replied. And that is what frightens me. The next few days proved Mirith correct. Reports came flooding in from across the galaxy about the effects of what people had started calling the Seojin broadcast. And those effects ranged from beautiful to beautiful to terrifying, depending on who was experiencing them on the Makari homeworld. A species that had prided itself on pure rationality for 15,000 years suddenly found themselves unable to make decisions without considering the emotional impact. And their government nearly collapsed as leaders who had never felt doubt began questioning every choice they had ever made. The Kreth, who had genetically removed their capacity for empathy generations ago, experienced something like a collective breakdown as dormant neural pathways suddenly reactivated and flooded their minds with sensations they had no framework for processing. But alongside the chaos came something else, something quieter and more hopeful. Young aliens from dozens of species began seeking out humans wherever they could find them, desperate to understand how to live with the intensity of feeling that the broadcast had awakened. And a movement began that had no official name but that most people called the Warming. Seojin met with some of them in the weeks after her recovery, sitting in small rooms on the Concord station and listening to their questions and their fears and their strange new joys. A young Makari, who had never cried before, asked her what to do with the pressure building behind his eyes. A Valathi elder, who had spent 3 centuries in emotional suppression, asked her how humans survived feeling so much without going mad. A Kreth soldier who had killed without remorse for 20 years asked her why he suddenly could not sleep without seeing the faces of everyone he had harmed. You do not survive it. Seojin told each of them in her own way. You learn to carry it. And sometimes the weight is too much, and sometimes you put it down for a while. And sometimes you share it with others, so you do not have to carry it alone. And that is the secret, the only secret. That humans never carry their pain alone. But not everyone in the galaxy welcomed the change. The Rationalist bloc formed within a month of the broadcast. An alliance of species who viewed human emotion as a threat to galactic stability. And their leaders made no secret of their intentions. Humanity has infected the galaxy with a mimetic contagion, declared High Chancellor Vorth of the Kreth Assembly in a speech that was broadcast across every network. They have weaponized their primitive emotional capacity and deployed it against species who had long ago evolved past such weakness. And we must ask ourselves whether this was an accident or an act of war. Seojin watched that speech from her quarters on the Concord station and felt a chill run through her. That had nothing to do with the recycled air. She had expected resistance, but she had not expected this. Had not anticipated that her attempt to help would be reframed as an attack. And as she listened to Vorth describe humanity as a virus that needed to be quarantined, she understood for the first time how vulnerable she had made her entire species. Earth's government was divided on how to respond. Some officials saw the Warming movement as an opportunity to build new alliances and expand human influence across the galaxy, while others argued that Seojin had exposed humanity's greatest weakness by showing the universe exactly how deeply humans could feel. They know how to hurt us now, said Secretary Chun during a closed-door briefing that Seojin attended via secure transmission. Before the broadcast, we were a curiosity, too small to threaten and too young to matter. But now they understand that our emotions are real and powerful, and that makes us a target. It also makes us valuable. Seojin replied. Species across the galaxy are waking up to feelings they forgot they could have. And they are looking to us to teach them how to live with those feelings. And that gives us something no amount of military power could ever provide. Leverage, said Secretary Chun. Connection, Seojin corrected. Which is better? The debate continued for hours, but in the end, Earth's government decided to wait and see how events unfolded. A decision that satisfied no one and left Seojin feeling more alone than ever. She found unexpected comfort in her conversations with Mirith, who visited her quarters several times a week to discuss the changes sweeping through Velati society. My elders are afraid, Mirith confided one evening. They spent centuries building walls inside their minds to keep emotion out, and now those walls are crumbling. And they do not know who they will be when the walls are gone. Neither do I, Seojin admitted. I have been angry and grieving and determined for so long that I am not sure I remember how to be anything else. They sat together in silence for a while. Two beings from different worlds, learning how to be uncertain together. Then Mira spoke again. And what the young Velathi said changed everything. The rationalist bloc is preparing a formal accusation against humanity, Mirith said. They claim to have evidence that human emotional capacity was not natural, that it was engineered by the architects who visited your world 70,000 years ago. And they will argue that this makes humanity a weapon that must be removed from galactic space. Seojin felt her blood run cold. They want to exile us, she whispered. Worse, Mirith replied. They want to prove that you were designed to destroy us. And once they prove that, exile will be the kindest option on the table. The next morning, Seojin received official notification that a galactic tribunal had been convened to examine the origins of human emotion. Humanity would stand trial, and Seojin would have to find a way to defend her species against an accusation that might just be true. The neural contacts pressed against her skin like fingers made of ice, and Yoon Seojin felt the boundary between herself and the universe begin to dissolve. She had expected pain, but what came instead was something stranger. A sensation of expanding outward in all directions at once, of becoming thin and wide like a drop of ink spreading through water. And somewhere in that expansion, she heard the first gasps from the assembly as 400 species suddenly found themselves inside her memories. The broadcast array translated human emotion into formats that alien minds could process. But no translation could soften the impact of what she carried. She gave them the refugee camp first. She was 19 years old again, and the sky above the Pacific coast was gray with smoke from cities that had burned for 3 weeks straight. And her brother Junsu lay on a cot in a medical tent that smelled of antiseptic and despair. And she was holding his hand while he died from an infection that a simple antibiotic could have cured if only they had more supplies. She showed them the sound of his breathing as it grew weaker. She showed them the way his fingers tightened around hers in the final moments, as if he could hold himself to life through the strength of their connection. She showed them the exact instant when his hand went limp and the light left his eyes, and something inside her shattered into pieces that would never fit together the same way again. In the assembly chamber, delegates from a dozen species fell to their knees. The Makari had no tear ducts, but their translucent bodies convulsed with colors that their own language had no words for. Shades of blue and purple that meant nothing in their emotional vocabulary because they had never felt grief this acute and had no reference point for processing it. The Velathi who hung from the ceiling began to keen. A high, thin sound that echoed through the chamber like the cry of something wounded. And 3 of their elders lost consciousness entirely because their neural systems could not handle the sensory overload of human loss. But Seojin was not finished. She gave them the years that followed. The grinding work of diplomacy, the endless meetings where she sat in rooms full of aliens who looked at her like she was a curiosity at best and an annoyance at worst. She showed them what it felt like to care about strangers, to lie awake at night thinking about people she had never met who were suffering in places she had never seen, to feel the weight of the entire world pressing down on her chest every time she read about another crisis that no one would address. She showed them the strange and terrible gift of human empathy, the ability to feel pain that was not her own as if it had been carved into her bones. And then she showed them Vareth 4. She had watched the recordings that Mirith mentioned, had studied the faces of the dying and the desperate. And now she poured those images through the broadcast array, with all the emotional weight that a human heart could carry. She showed them a mother holding a child whose skin had turned gray with plague, rocking back and forth in a room where everyone else had already died. She showed them an old man who had walked for 3 days to reach a medical station, only to find it abandoned and empty. She showed them a young girl about the same age Seojin had been when Junsu died, sitting alone in the ruins of what had been her home, staring at nothing because everything she loved was gone. "You asked once why humans cry," Seojin said aloud, and her voice carried through the chamber even as her memories continued to flood the broadcast array. "You studied our tears under microscopes and analyzed the chemical composition and concluded that it was a primitive stress response, a leftover reflex from our evolutionary past." She felt the neural contacts burning against her temples now, felt blood beginning to trickle from her nose as the array pushed her brain past its limits. "But you missed the point," she continued. "We do not cry because we are weak. We cry because we feel what is not ours to feel. We grieve for strangers. We carry the pain of people we have never met in places we have never seen. And we cannot stop. We have tried to stop and we cannot. It is who we are." The Kreth delegation had stopped moving entirely, their rigid exoskeletons locked in place as they processed sensations that their species had deliberately engineered out of themselves 10,000 years ago. The Unified Territories delegates were clutching each other like children afraid of the dark. Even Speaker Tovan stood frozen at his podium, his forearms hanging limp at his sides. 12 million people are dying on Vareth 4, Seojin said, and she could feel the edges of her consciousness beginning to fray, could feel the broadcast array pulling more from her than any human mind was designed to give. And you sit here debating procedure while they suffer. And I cannot make you care. No one can make anyone care. But I can show you what caring feels like. And I can ask you to decide whether you want to remember this feeling or forget it ever happened. She released one final memory into the broadcast, her brother's face in the moment before he died. The fear and the love and the desperate hope all mixed together. And then the way his expression went slack and empty. And then the silence that followed the neural contacts disengaged with a sound like a lock clicking open, and Seojin slumped forward in the chair, her vision going dark around the edges as her body tried to cope with what she had just done to herself. She heard voices shouting and felt hands catching her before she hit the floor. But everything seemed very far away now, like sounds heard through deep water. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Speaker Tovan's face. And for the first time in 7 years of dealing with him, she saw something other than cold political calculation in his eyes. She saw tears when Seojin woke in the medical bay 6 hours later. The first thing she heard was the news that the Assembly had voted to send aid to Vareth 4. The vote had been unanimous and across the galaxy, in homes and ships and stations where the broadcast had been recorded and shared. 400 species were learning for the first time what it truly meant to feel. The galaxy had heard a new voice, and nothing would ever be the same. Yoon Seojin stood at the edge of the observation gallery and watched the delegates arrive for the assembly session that would decide the fate of 12 million lives on a world she had never seen. The dots at Galactic Concord Station stretched around her like a flower made of metal and light, its petals curving outward to embrace the void between stars. And within those petals walked representatives of 400 species who had mastered the art of talking without ever truly saying anything. She had served as Earth's ambassador to this place for 7 years now. And in all that time she had learned one truth above all others. The galaxy did not care about suffering unless suffering knocked on its door with something valuable in hand. Today, the Assembly would vote on whether to send medical aid to Vareth 4, a small planet on the edge of known space where a plague had begun killing everything it touched. And Seojin already knew how that vote would end. Ambassador Yoon, said a voice beside her, and she turned to find Councillor Dreth of the Makari floating at her shoulder, his translucent body pulsing with the soft blue light that indicated polite disinterest. I trust you will not attempt to speak today, as you did during the last session. Earth has the right to address the Assembly on humanitarian matters, Seojin replied, keeping her voice calm even as something cold settled in her stomach. Earth has observer status, Dreth corrected her, which grants the right to request permission to speak. And that request was denied 4 times in the previous cycle. And I suspect it will be denied again today. I mention this only as a courtesy because I find your species fascinating in the way one finds unusual insect fascinating. He drifted away before she could respond, leaving her alone with her anger and her helplessness and the weight of 12 million strangers pressing down on her shoulders. The assembly chamber occupied the heart of the station, a vast sphere where gravity had been carefully shaped so that each delegation could sit in its preferred orientation. And when Seojin took her place in the human section, she looked up and saw the Velothi hanging from what she considered the ceiling, and sideways to see the Kreth standing on what she considered the walls. Speaker Torvan of the Unified Territories took the central platform. His forearms spread wide in the gesture that meant the session had begun. We address today the matter of Vareth 4, he announced. His voice translated instantly into 17,000 languages. Where a biological event has rendered the population unable to sustain itself without external intervention. And we must determine whether such intervention falls within the mandate of the Concord. For 3 hours, Seojin listened to species after species explain why they could not help, why they should not help, why helping would set a dangerous precedent or strain limited resources or interfere with the natural development of a pre-contact civilization. The Makari argued that providing aid would create dependency. The Velothi worried about the political implications of favoring one crisis over another. The Kreth simply stated that Vareth 4 had nothing to offer in return, and therefore nothing to discuss. When Seojin raised her hand to request speaking rights, the speaker acknowledged her with the smallest possible movement of his head, and then announced that her request would be considered during the next recess. And when the recess came, he announced that the request had been denied due to scheduling concerns. She sat in her chair and felt something inside her chest begin to crack. A junior aide from the Velothi delegation approached her during the meal break. A young creature whose name she remembered as Mirith, Ambassador. Mirith whispered, looking around as if afraid to be seen speaking with a human. There is something you should know. A procedure that has not been used in 2,000 years, but remains technically valid under the original Concord Charter. I am listening, Seojin said. It is called resonance rights, and it allows any species to address the assembly without permission if they invoke shared suffering. But the catch is that the speaker must connect to the neural broadcast array and share not just their words, but their emotions, their memories, the full truth of what they feel. And it has not been used because most species consider such exposure to be a form of surrender. Seojin felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Mirth's color shifted to something Seojin had never seen before, a shade that her translator could not interpret. "Because I watched the recordings from Vareth 4, the young alien said, and I felt something I do not understand. And when I asked my elders what it was, they told me to stop asking. And I think you know what it is, and I think you could show them." Then Mirth was gone, vanished into the crowd of delegates returning to their seats for the final vote. Seojin sat very still and thought about what she was being asked to do. She thought about the neural broadcast array and what it would mean to open her mind to 400 species who had spent centuries dismissing humanity as emotional primitives too young to understand the way the galaxy worked. She thought about her brother Junsu, who had died in the Pacific refugee crisis when she was 19 years old. How she had held his hand in a hospital tent while the world fell apart around them. How she had promised him that she would find a way to make things better. She thought about 12 million people on a planet she had never seen who were dying right now while delegates debated procedure. When the assembly reconvened and Speaker Tolvan called for the final vote, Seojin stood up. "Ambassador Yoon," the speaker said, "you do not have the floor. I invoke resonance rights," she said. And her voice carried across the chamber, because in that moment she spoke not as a diplomat, but as something older and more dangerous. Under Article 7 of the original Concord Charter, I claim the right to address this assembly through shared suffering. The chamber went silent. No one had invoked resonance rights in 2,000 years, because no one had been willing to pay the price. And every delegate in that room understood that this small human woman was about to do something that most of them considered unthinkable. "The charter is clear," Speaker Torvan said slowly. "You have the right to connect to the broadcast array, but Ambassador, I must warn you that our systems were not designed for human neural patterns, and we cannot predict what will happen." "I understand," Seojin said. She walked to the central platform where the broadcast array waited like a crown of silver thorns. And as she sat down in the chair and felt the neural contacts press against her temples, she closed her eyes and thought of her brother. She thought of every funeral she had attended and every tear she had shed and every moment she had felt the pain of strangers as if it were her own. And then she opened her mind, and 400 species learned what it meant to be human.